Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I'm out here at the Boulder Flatirons, one of the most spectacularly beautiful places here in Colorado, doing a quick comparison this morning of my Canon 5DSR, which for the last 2 years or so that I've been using it, I've always thought had comparable results to medium format. So today, with the Fujifilm GFX 50s Mark II, I get to put that assumption to the test, and I'll also throw my Canon R5 in the mix. So I'm just going to do a quick composition of the Boulder Flatirons behind me here at sunrise, set at probably about 50 millimeters, and hopefully with some of that nice warm early morning light illuminating the mountain peaks. So let's get the camera set up and get this comparison started. So here you can see I have the composition set up on the 5DSR, and it's fairly straightforward. Just focus right in on the Flatirons in the distance, and I am set at right at about 55 millimeters on the Canon 24-70 2.8 Mark II lens, which will be about as far as I can zoom in on the Fuji GFX, still working with the 35-70 millimeter lens for that setup. And now I'm just waiting for a little bit of that early morning glow to strike the mountain peaks. And once the light is perfect on this scene, I'm going to swap out the 5DSR for the Fuji GFX 50s Mark II with the 35-70 millimeter lens. I'm going to zoom all the way into 70 millimeters. I'm set at f10 ISO 100 on the 5DSR and f11 ISO 100 on the Fuji. So the main point for this morning's comparison is purely on image quality. The other features of the GFX, like the in-body stabilization and some of the other different features, are nice, but not really the point of my comparison this morning. Now, there are a few clouds off to the east, which is creating a bit of a warm, soft glowing effect on the top of the mountain peaks. So this will actually be better. It'll give me a little bit more time to swap out the three different cameras to get a comparable image so that we can compare the three without having to rush and try to change with rapidly changing light. So that being said, I'm going to grab this first image on the 5DSR right now. Make sure everything is nice and in focus. I'm focused right in on the mountain peaks. f10 ISO 100. All right, and now I'm going to switch over to the Fuji and get the same exact image. Okay, so now for the Fuji, I'm set at right around 70 millimeters, which is about 55 on the Canon 5DSR. Manually focused on these mountain peaks. Grab this image, f11 ISO 100. And now switching over to the Canon R5. So here is the composition that I have set up for the three different cameras. Hopefully this comparison is helpful. Let's get these three images on the computer and see how they look. Well, I made it back to the studio, and River decided to join for the evaluation of these images. So I'm going to be comparing 4 different scenes. Then stay tuned for the very end, where I reveal my favorite image from this morning and compare it to 2 days before, showing a drastically different scene with some crazy changes in the weather. So with that, let's dive right in. First, before I start, I'll just say that this is a very detailed look at each of these 3 camera bodies, and all of them are spectacular, and I'm fortunate to be able to use any of the 3, let alone each of them. So with that, let's dive right into the comparison to see how the R5 compares to the 5DSR and the Fuji GFX 50s Mark II. So starting with the Fuji image, I want to compare it first to the Canon R5, since this is what I've been using extensively for the past 2 years or so. And right off the bat, these two look very similar. I'm not seeing a ton of difference between the 5DSR image and the 50s Mark II image. maybe a little bit more color saturation in the medium format image, a little bit more reddish color in these highlights, but overall, these two look very similar. So let's zoom in and take a look at the details. So let's pick this section here. And the 5DSR detail is great at 100% as expected, but the 50S Mark II image detail really looks pretty incredible, especially like in this region with the different trees and the rocks. They just look much more clear in the Fuji image. So about what I was expecting with the medium format sensor, but I was expecting maybe a little bit more sharpness on the 5DSR side. That being said, with just a little bit of editing, I think I could get this 5DSR file with some vibrancy adjustments, some sharpening to look close to what this Fuji image looks like. So pretty cool comparison, and I'm glad to see that there is a big step up in the medium format image, but also that the 5DSR image seems to be performing well. Just to compare, let's look at the R5 image next, zooming into the same section. And I'm still expecting to see more detail in the 5DSR, which definitely does seem to be the case, especially if you look down in this section, like with this tree. It's definitely more defined in the 5DSR image compared to the R5, which is to be expected with the slightly higher megapixel count and also the lack of the AA filter. So this image here shows why I've been still using the 5DSR in 2023, even though I have the R5 when the lighting conditions are ideal. So comparing the R5 image now to the Fuji image, one of the first things that stands out to me is the R5 image tends to shift a little bit more yellow. So specifically in these highlights, the faces of the rocks in the Flatirons are a little bit more yellow and a little less saturated than they are in the Fuji image. And each of these three photos was taken within about 20 seconds of each other, so there's not enough of a change in time for there really to be this big of a difference in the tones. The other thing to call out too is if I pull the 5DSR image up here on the right, you can see this has a little bit more of this reddish warm light on the Flatirons. And I used the same 24 to 70 millimeter lens for both of these cameras, so the difference in color profile is down to the camera body and not because of the lens itself. So switching back to the Fuji image, let's compare the detail from the GFX image to the R5. And again, definitely seeing a lot more detail and clarity in this rock face compared to the R5 image. You can see it here along the edge of the trees where the medium format sensor is really delivering a lot of crisp detail, and the colors in this look much more true to life from how I remember this scene while I was standing there. So zooming out, this is definitely how I remember this moment when I was standing there photographing this scene compared to the R5, which feels just a little bit washed out and I think would require a bit more editing to get this image to align a little bit more closely to how I experienced the Flatirons this morning. But cool comparison and a lot of great detail in the R5, but the 50S Mark II definitely performs better with the detail and color rendition and really is a spectacular image. Very impressive. So next up, what I did is I lifted the shadows from these three prior images just to see how this darker section behind the mountains in the shadow would look when the shadows are pushed. So specifically the detail, the colors, how do they compare across each of the three different camera bodies? So let's start with the Fuji image, which if you look compared to the original, you can see the difference in shadow tones that I lifted. But other than that, no other change in the colors or sharpness. So first, let's compare to the 5DSR again. And one of the limitations of the 5DSR that I've known about for 2 years now is the dynamic range. So I'm expecting this to not be all that pretty. So zooming into the shadowy region,
Definitely a lot more color accuracy and detail in the GFX image, which is what I'd expected. And over here, the details look pretty smeary. I'm seeing a lot of color noise in this section, so about what I'd expected, and really is the reason why I don't use the 5DSR when the lighting conditions are really challenging. Instead, what I typically do is opt for the R5 when I know that there's a challenge in dynamic range. So let's bring this one up for comparison. Looking at this same section, and it does look like the colors look a little bit better on the R5 compared to the 5DSR. Details look okay through here, and definitely not as much noise as the 5DSR in the same section. So through here you can see a little bit more color noise. Some of these trees look like they're showing some funky colors in through here, and the details actually look worse in the 5DSR than they do in the R5. They just look a little bit smeary anytime I push the shadows really hard. But in the R5 image, some of the details are still pretty clear, despite pushing the shadows pretty heavily. So again, about what I'd expected, and I'm glad to see that the R5 image holds up well when pushed really far, because this is definitely the camera body that I've been relying on when the lighting conditions are challenging. Next, let's go over to some of the more contrasty scenes. You can see this is the R5 image compared to the Fuji image. So Fuji on the right, R5 on the left. And the light was changing so rapidly at this point that it's not really a apples to apples comparison as far as the color tones or anything like that. But if we zoom in, we're still seeing some good detail in the shadows for both camera bodies, and it looks like the highlights are well maintained. So it looks like both of these cameras did a pretty good job with capturing the different highlights and coming out with a nice balanced image despite the more direct light. Looking at the 5DSR image, the light was even stronger yet. And it does look like some of these shadowy areas are a little bit more crushed. I don't know if the detail in this section is recoverable. You can bring it up over here. Let's take a look. So if we zoom into this really dark section and try to lift these shadows, we're going to see a lot more noise. So again, the 5DSR performs really well with good conditions, but not exactly the option that I'd want to go to when the light is challenging like it was in this scene. So the next thing I wanted to look at was this cool yellow barn that I saw on the drive home, which really caught my eye with the yellow tone set against the blue sky, thinking maybe we could see a little bit of difference with how each of these camera bodies handles a more true yellow subject. I know that the R5 tended to shift a little bit yellow with the prior examples, so let's take a look and see how it performs here. So let's start with the Fuji image and compare it to the R5. And again, we're seeing, first off, just a slight difference in the blues, so a different color profile. It looks like here, even though I set the temperature the same and tried to balance the images, the yellow in the barn face looks a little bit more accurate to how I remember it in the Fuji image. So a very unscientific approach, but zoomed into these two sections side by side, you can see that the Canon image looks almost a little bit mustardy, while the Fuji image looks a little bit more balanced. Zooming into some of the more detailed sections, and we look at the details, especially the dust in the window and the screen up here, you can see that the Fuji image is much more detailed and crisper than the R5 image. The other thing I liked about this barn was the ability to look to see in the shadow section how the color tones held up across each of the different camera bodies. So again, the Fuji image, this looks much more natural, at least to my eye, compared to the R5 image, which almost looks a little bit gray. And if we bring up the 5DSR image, the yellow tones look even a little stranger in this 5DSR image, and the shadow section looks very gray. So definitely a huge improvement with the Fuji medium format sensor in the shadow tones. Looking at the same section for the details, and it looks like the 5DSR image is pretty close to the Fuji image, but the Fuji still has the edge as far as sharpness and clarity goes. So I did get a chance to take these cameras out on a different evening the night before, although I wasn't able to do much video work. And when I took these 3 camera bodies out, again, I saw the same thing with the R5 image tending to shift a little bit more towards the yellow tones, which you can really see in this bottom section in the reeds in the foreground. If I zoom in, you'll see that both images are still nice and sharp. Great detail here in the R5 image, but the tones look a little bit more muted and a little bit more yellow. In comparison, switching over to the 5DSR image, I'm seeing a little bit more natural color in these reeds in the foreground. And if I zoom in to check on the sharpness of each, this one looks pretty comparable. The other thing I noticed in this scene was the tones in the Fuji image, particularly in the highlights in this section up here with the sunset illuminating the clouds. It looks much more natural and true to how I remember it in the Fuji image, where the highlights in this section through here seem to lose a little bit of this orangish tone. Moving over to the R5 image in this same section, and again you can see this yellow shift. So the yellow shift was definitely something that was common with the R5, regardless of what I was photographing or which time of day and different color conditions. So you can really see the detail in the reeds here compared to the detail in the reeds in the R5. Very crisp and clear in the GFX image, and the colors look much more lifelike, where in the R5 they look a little bit yellow and grayish. So just something that was a consistent observation that I'd call out, but I'm sure with a little bit of tweaking and editing, zoomed out to normal viewing distances, any of these 3 cameras would produce exceptional results. So I hope you found this comparison useful between these 3 camera bodies, and the Fuji definitely seems to live up to the hype from what I've heard from a lot of other people, as well as delivering superior color accuracy, amazing detail, and just really incredible system to use. And I definitely think it's lived up to my expectations going into this test. That being said, the 5DSR is still no slouch, even in 2023, and I plan to be keeping this for the foreseeable future. But when image quality is paramount and I need the best as far as color accuracy, detail, and true tones to life, I will definitely be reaching for the Fuji GFX 50s first, followed by the trusty 5DSR not far after. So with that said, I will show you the final image from this morning, which was the second one that we reviewed, shot on the Fuji GFX 50s Mark II at 70mm on the 35 to 70mm lens, and with all the final edits made. So I will put that up right now.
Well, I hope you found the comparison of the 5DSR and the Fujifilm GFX 50s Mark II medium format camera helpful. If you've been considering a move to medium format, as I have been for a long time, I hope that this is a video that shares some good insights on the sharpness, color rendition, different pros and cons of using a digital medium format setup. So I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to use this moving forward. I don't plan to get rid of the 5DSR anytime soon, especially because I love using the 100 to 400 and 11 to 24 millimeter zooms on this one, where the Fujifilm, right now I currently just have the 35 to 70 millimeter standard zoom in my lens setup for this camera system. The 35 to 70 millimeter lens is also much lighter than the standard 24 to 70 that I use on the 5DSR. So for backpacking, hiking, this will actually be a lighter option, which is kind of crazy to say that a medium format camera is more portable than my full frame. Got a great used deal on this camera and really excited to shoot with it moving forward. And I'm sure you'll be seeing it around a lot on this channel. So I hope you enjoyed this morning's video. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you around in the next one.